class, this is Miss Sipe. How are you, everyone? I miss you. I hope that you are doing well. It's been really fun to see a lot of your faces coming over and bringing some books. And if anyone wants more books, just call me and I'll come right up and swap some out for some new ones. I have paint on my hands, excuse me. I've been painting a little bit. And here goes chapter 21. So think about our book, you guys, so far. This has been such a long time. We've been reading this since the classroom. Chapter 21 today is going to wrap everything up, and I want you to just listen, and maybe while you're reading, think about what you think is going to happen. Remember the last chapter, Grandma and Grandpa had sort of resolved their issues with what happened the night that she found them outside, and she threw away his gun, and then Jeannie was really surprised to wake up in the morning and find out that they were getting along and that they were in the kitchen. Then Grandpa had given Ernie his glasses. So I'm just going to read chapter 21 right now. I want you to think about, as we're reading, what do you think is going to happen? And I really want you to think about how the characters have changed since the beginning of the book to the end, and we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of it, but think about the title, It's Brave as You, and think about what that means, and then we'll have some questions to discuss afterward. Chapter 21, here goes. Day 29, like deja vu. Everyone, including Tess, waited outside for Ernie to come out, the same way they had waited for him on his birthday. "What's taken that boy so long?" said Grandma, wearing the earrings she bought from Tess. She popped the elastic waistband on her dress. "I don't want to be late. Binks is doing us a favor doing this." "He's coming," Jeannie said, staring down at the front door. He was putting his sneakers on. Truth was, he was wondering what was taking Ernie so long, too. That was the moment that he was going to give Ernie Bruce Lee's tooth. He had tucked it away in a little pocket in his shorts, ready for when Ernie burst through the door so that he could wish him luck at the dentist. He was going to tell him to tuck that tooth into his chapstick pocket for the protection of Bruce Lee, the dragon. But Ernie was taking forever. Grandpa was wearing different shades, big black ones that looked like they belonged to one of the characters from the Back to the Future calendar on the wall that Jeannie had been looking at for weeks. With one hand on Jeannie's shoulder, as usual, Grandpa suggested, "Maybe the boy got the poopsies." "Gross," Tess said, snickering. "The what?" Jeannie asked. "The poopsies," Grandpa repeated. "You never heard of the oopsie poopsies?" "Brooke, please," Grandma pleaded. Grandpa laughed, and he ran his hand along Jeannie's face until he found his ear. Then he whispered for a second. "Ernie don't have that," Jeannie yelped. "He might. When you're nervous about something, it just happens." Grandma squinted at her watch. "Let me go get this boy." But she didn't need to, because the door flew open, slipping against the side of the house. "Told you," Jeannie said, up-chinning at Grandpa. Ernie stood on the porch, looking like Ernie, like he used to before the shoot. His hands were in his pockets. He didn't have on a mask, but the best part was that he was wearing Grandpa's sunglasses, the ones that he gave him. He looked cool again. "I was just coming to get you," Grandma said. "It's almost 2 o'clock and I don't want to be late." Ernie trotted off the porch, and Tess was right there to hug him. Ernie smiled wide, metal from splint braces glinting in the sun as he headed to the car. Tess smiled too, flushing all colorful rubber bands in her mouth. Jeannie wiggled his finger into the chapstick pocket. "Ernie, hold up. I got something for you." "What?" Ernie waited, half in and half out of the car. He held out his hand. Jeannie dropped the tooth into his brother's open palm. "A pebble?" Ernie said with some attitude. "Nope." Jeannie felt it. He felt his chest swelling. "That's one of Bruce Lee's teeth." Ernie looked closer. "No way." "Yep, I got it from the tooth man. It's a good luck charm." Ernie closed his fist around the tooth. "Bruce Lee? Really?" "Well, all right, man." He put his arm around Jeannie's neck and he yanked him close like he always used to, and it was headlock time. "Thanks." He dipped onto the passenger side of Grandma's Buick, now which was cranked up and rumbling and ready to go. "He got the shades on?" Grandpa was asking. "Yep, he got the shades on." Jeannie could feel Grandpa smiling behind him. He didn't even have to look. Once Ernie and Grandma were gone, and Jeannie walked Grandpa back to the house, actually watched as Grandpa walked himself back up to the house, he and Tess decided that this was the perfect time to go check the trap. They weren't sure when they would have another moment when Grandma would be gone. So they could sneak that bird cage right past Grandpa easy. Jeannie yelled to Grandpa that he'd be right back, grabbing his swatting stick, and then he asked Tess what the heck she was doing. She had her hands pressed together and her head bowed. "Praying to the big bird for the miracle." "What do you think I'm doing?" she zapped. "If we don't catch this bird, you're a dead man. I'm just praying that when you go to heaven, you don't bump into your long-lost feathered friend Michael Jackson. 'Cause I'm sure that he's P.O.'d, she said. "Joke." Then once again, they headed through the wood towards the strange yellow house, swiping limbs from their path and jumping over thick roots bursting through the earth. As the brush began to thin and the yellow house was in plain sight, Jeannie could hear something different from the normal nature sounds. The sound of something trapped, the short, choppy fluttering of wings slapping against wood. It was a bird, it had to be. Jeannie broke free from the forest, Tess right on him, skidded to his knees, and peered through the slits in the slats on the bluish bird strutting back and forth. He knew right away. Head was hooded in blue, the chest orange, just like Tito and Germaine and Marlin and Jackie. "It's a barn swallow," Jeannie cried, grasping Tess' arm. "We did it! Well, let's get it!" Tess's idea of getting it was no big deal, huh? They didn't have a bag. Okay, this was dumb, so plan B on the fly. "Well, there's actually only one way I can think of it," said Tess, "and first to have a plan B. The first one is to have a plan B. We block both sides of the box, then lift it real slow, and then we'll grab it." Jeannie paused. He'd been afraid of touching the dead bird, and honestly, he was pretty scared to touch a living one too, especially knowing that he then had to walk it into the woods and walk it through the woods. But he knew it had to be done. This was his time. This was his chance, and he was ready. He gave Tess the okay nod. Once they positioned themselves across from each other, Jeannie glanced at the yard in front of him. The rickety bird cages all cracked and mangled and peeking from just behind the house. He thought about how birds were once in, each of them were in one, how each of the same birds were let go, and they were strong enough to fly. "Okay, I'll lift, you grab," Tess was saying, holding the sides of the box. "Got it." Jeannie refocused, and he readied his hands like a quarterback before calling a hike. "All set?" Jeannie nodded. Tess lifted the box, and Jeannie slid his hands in, and his fingers touching the feathers. Then wrapping around the body of the swallow. Okay, I got it. Tess lifted the box completely, and then Jeannie swallowed the trap between his palms. For 4 whole seconds, the bird began to struggle, to flap its wings, and as soon it lurched into its fight to fly, pecking at Jeannie's hand, and he got scared. Then he let go. "Jeannie!" Tess cried as the swallow took off. Jeannie's eyes pricked with tears, hands still cupped, watching in disbelief as his good luck just flew away. The walk back through their woods was a slow trek. He'd been so close to catching that bird and setting things right, so close. At the same time, he couldn't stop thinking about those cages and how the bird fought and how nothing was wrong with it. It wasn't hurt, it was free. And Jeannie wanted to trap it. And how would the new Michael Jackson feel? Jeannie felt kind of silly thinking about the feeling of the bird, especially since this was a serious situation and he couldn't shake it. And he knew he needed to do something else, but he just wasn't sure what. He was busy beating himself up in his head, but he didn't even notice Grandpa on the porch, sitting on the porch all by himself, until he reached the porch himself. Grandpa was outside. Grandpa came outside by himself, and he thought that it was only the front porch. Outside was outside. "Listen, there's still time. We'll get it," Tess whispering before giving Jeannie a hug and then heading down the hill. She probably would have stayed and hung out, but Jeannie was clearly not in the mood. Plus, Grandpa had 2 mason jars of tea all ready, not 3. Jeannie took a seat, a little surprised that Grandpa's tea was tea. Grandpa took a sip, so did Jeannie. "Too sweet?" Grandpa asked. "No, just right," Jeannie said, sitting awkwardly next to Grandpa like they were on a first date or something. Like how Jeannie and Tess used to sit next to it, like how Ernie and Tess used to sit next to each other when they first met. A squeak came from Samantha's house. She was chewing on her bite buddy. "So, Littlewood, tell me about Brooklyn." "Tell about what?" "I don't know, tell me a story." Jeannie just thought for a moment, but he couldn't come up with any stories, at least not about Brooklyn. He could have told so many stories about how he killed a bird and tried to catch another one, but "I don't have a story, Grandpa, but I do have a question," Jeannie asked. "Of course you do. Okay, well, shoot." Jeannie thought back to the first breakfast when he had asked Grandpapa about wearing sunglasses in the house. How it was awkward at first, but then afterward, Grandpapa was honest with Jeannie about everything, including him being crazy, which Jeannie now figured was just a family trait. "Well, what's the deal with the yellow house back in the woods?" Grandpa pressed his lips tight, and then he said, "You know what I like about you? If you want to know, you just ask." Not really. Jeannie had all kinds of questions that he'd written down and actually hadn't asked. Questions Google couldn't even answer. Questions like, why are all the birds in the bird cages?
What about great-grandpa's suicide? But he figured now was not the time to go straight to the source. A breeze came out of nowhere and swept across the porch. Jeannie imagined him and Grandpa were sitting on a giant spoon, and that God was holding them up to his mouth and blowing on them like hot soup. "So that old house," Grandpa began. But before he could get into it, the squeak, squeak from Samantha's house turned into barking and the rickety sounds of a nearly broken-down car coming up the hill. Grandpa straightened up as the driver's side door swung open. Crab swung himself out of the car. "Now, if I had a cat, I suppose I would have been dragging you in, huh?" You know the phrase, "Look what the cat drug in." Grandpa said, like an old cowboy. "I suppose," Crab said, loping over to the porch. "Well, I got a dog." Then out of nowhere, Grandpa hollered, "Sick him, Samantha, sick him!" Samantha stopped barking with almost perfect timing and then made a few circles before lying back down in the hot sun. "I agree, Sammy, it ain't worth it. We'll just wait for Mary to get back." "Come on, Brooke." Crab looked pained. "What are you here for, Crab?" Crab pulled the cigar from his mouth, spit, then put it right back in where it had been. "I came by to check on the boy and to drop off some goodies." Crab tossed the rolled-up paper bag to Jeannie and set a brown bag bottle on the porch. "Thought that was your daughter's job now." "Well, it is, but that's just because I knew that she was going to be coming up here anyway. Plus, to be frank, I felt so darn bad, I didn't know what to do. I guess I just thought it would be better for me to lay low and hide out for a while. Especially from Mary. Shoot, it was bad enough having Tess mad at me." Grandpa took a sip of his tea and he nodded. He'd keep a straight face, a cold one, since Crab pulled up. But he let it slip, like mean mug relaxing, and he admitted, "I can't blame you for that. Truth is, ain't been much better for me up here on the hill. But Jeannie's being here to keep my head on." "And Ernie? He's fine. At least he's going to be fine." Crab nodded again. "All right, well, I'm heading back down the hill. Just stopped by to drop that stuff off." Crab said, heading towards his car. "Crab," Grandpa called, getting up from the seat and inching forward, swinging his arm low until it touched the bottle. "Take that with you." Crab paused, puzzled. He glanced at Jeannie, then back at Grandpa before grabbing the bottle and the toe bouncing back to his junker. As Crab's car left in a loud cloud of smoke and dust, Samantha snapped back into action, jumping around and barking. The breeze picked up even more and the sky rumbled like an upset stomach. Jeannie was buzzing about the whole Crab-Grandpa interaction, trying to figure out what all of it meant. It seemed like it was some kind of amends. But Jeannie couldn't be too sure. He took a peek in the bag. Whoa, a fly mother load. Crab was definitely trying to make amends. Now, where was I? "You were going to tell me about the yellow house." Right. Jeannie immediately thought it was about another stinky armpit moment, but Grandpa put that to rest by saying, "I smell rain. It's going to be a long story, so how about we go back to the house?" Samantha finally stopped barking. Matter of fact, Samantha's part of the story, but not this Sam, the original Sam. Jeannie wasn't exactly sure what Grandpa meant, but he followed him anyway, mason jars and a bag of flies in his hand, as Grandpa headed for the door. Once inside, Grandpa, to Jeannie's surprise, moved through the kitchen, right past the None Your Business store, right into the living room. He felt around and he eased into the porch. He eased onto a couch that Jeannie had never seen Grandpa sit on. He reached out to grab his drink from Jeannie, then he patted the cushion next to him. "Sit." Jeannie sat. He laid the bag of flies between them, and before he could take another sip of his own tea, Grandpa ripped right into the story. "When I was a youngster, living in that yellow house down there in the woods, there was a man named Barnabas Saint who used to live at the bottom of the hill, not too far from Crab and Tess. Barnabas was probably the only person that my daddy called a friend. They worked together, and back in those days, black men down here worked the tobacco fields. Times were different, you understand? That was early Jim Crow days." Jeannie had learned some of this in his social studies class. Racism, slavery, question for later, who was Jim Crow? "My daddy and Barnabas Saint worked a field 2 or 3 miles down the road owned by this man with the last name Bristol. Now, old man Bristol used to love dogs, and he kept them in his barn. Same barn that made all the field hands, my daddy, Barnabas, and a whole bunch of other men, keep the farm tools. Up there with the dogs and the dog mess and all of that." He leaned forward, and Jeannie could tell that the story was about to get good, even though he was still waiting for Grandpa to tell him about the yellow house. Bristol was a mean son of a gun. I mean, just a nasty you-know-what. Always threatening men, yelling at them like they weren't people, like they were his dogs, too. So one day, long after Bristol's man gave birth to a litter, all the men went to the barn to put their tools away. It had been a hard day, and Barnabas had had enough, and he decided that he was going to steal himself a puppy. So he reached down to snatch one of those little rascals. He stuffed it in his hat. He tucked his hat under his arm. Barnabas and my daddy ran the whole 3 miles home, laughing their heads off. Grandpa leaned back again. The rain had finally started, gently tapping against the roof. "What happened?" Jeannie asked, now all in. Well, it turned out that old man Bristol knew exactly how many pups was in that litter, and after all the questioning all the men the next day and threatening them really, one guy broke and he said that he saw Daddy and Barnabas run out of the barn suspiciously. Oh man is right. Bristol showed up at that yellow house, all in my daddy's face, asking all kinds of questions. I was just a kid. I came to the door to see what was going on, and my daddy told me to go to my room. I ran up to the top of the stairs, but then stayed there and listened to Bristol tell my father the story. And he told them that, sorry guys, I ran to the top of the stairs, but now stayed there and listened to Bristol tell my father that either he'd tell them the truth or he would have our whole family killed. What? Jeannie gasped, not believing his ears. He could do that. Back then, a lot of people could. So what did your dad do? Grandpa looked at Jeannie square. He did what he had to do. He told Bristol that Barnabas stole the puppy. Grandpa lifted his right leg. He rested his ankle on his left knee so he could scratch his ankle bite scar. Bristol fixed my daddy on the spot. The next day, Barnabas came to the house upset because he had gone to the field and Bristol had fired him too. But my dad didn't tell him that he already knew what happened. My father just couldn't face him. He couldn't admit what he'd done. He couldn't apologize for what he knew full well was coming next to Barnabas. And when he finally had the courage to make it right, it was too late. Bristol and his boys set Barnabas's house on fire, Grandpa noted slowly. Burned to death. The house smoked for 2 days. On the 3rd day, my father, who had become like a ghost himself, went down to Barnabas's. I always felt like he went to pay his respects to Barney's spirit or something. But when he came back from the burned house, he had that puppy. And my mother named her Samantha. Jeannie gasped again. You mean the puppy lived? Yup, the dog lived, Grandpa replied. And that wasn't the only time that my pop went down to Barnabas's house. He would go there all the time. He could come back with pieces of wood for the floors, screen wire for the doors and windows. That's what he used to make those bird cages you and your brother found. Jeannie froze, caught. Yeah, that's right. I know all about that. Your grandma told me. Grandpa flashed a slick grin. Some of them very same cages are in my room, but you already know about that too, don't you, little Wood? Jeannie's breath caught in his throat. Grandpa dropped a leg. Anyway, why am I even telling you this story again? We were talking about Samantha, the yellow house, Jeannie reminded him. All right, point is, my old man was never the same. He was already a little scattered from his time in the war, and everybody thinks that the war is what drove him over the edge. But after that whole thing with Barnabas, it really got bad. It was what broke him, because he couldn't forgive himself. Not for making the decision that he made, but for not apologizing and being honest with his friend when he had the chance. The old man was locked in guilt for the rest of his life. Grandpa circled the rim of the jar with his finger, and that's why I keep Sam, or a version of Sam, around, as a reminder. But what about the tree and all those birds? Jeannie asked, trying to keep the conversation going a little longer, hoping to shake the weird feeling that was creeping into his stomach. Plus, he really wanted to know. I mean, what made that happen? Grandpa crossed his legs. I don't know. What do you think? Jeannie did have a thought, one that came instantly, probably from every scary movie that he ever sneak watched, combining with the story of Grandpa had just told him. A thought about whether people could die and then come back. If Grandpa's dad could be that tree, still trying to break free from the guilt, or maybe Barnabas Saint was the tree, tearing the house apart, and Great-Grandpa was the birds, sitting in all that mess, eating themselves. Either way, Jeannie knew he couldn't actually say this to Grandpa. He wasn't even sure that he knew how to say it without sounding silly or mean. But what if it were true? Could that happen to Jeannie? Or Grandpa? Or to Dad? But what if it can't be true? It can't be. Don't be stupid. Too many scary movies. But what if? By now, Jeannie had a lump in his throat, the size of, well, like a small bird. Thoughts were emerging every which way. The death of Michael Jackson, the disposing of the body, the constant fear that Grandpa would find out, and the fact was that he wasn't sure anymore that if he could catch another one. And he realized also that he felt trapped himself, trapped in a deep hole that he had dug all by himself. I don't know, was all Jeannie could say, his head spinning, but he knew. He knew what he needed to do to keep himself from beginning a nasty bird eating other birds or trees growing in a scary house. He knew it was time to come clean. Grandpa, I need to tell you something. What's that, grandson? And then the front door opened. How could you have let this happen? Dad's voice came through the house. His dad? His dad? His parents were back? It sounded like he was storming into the kitchen, followed by Grandma, Ernie, and Ma. And Dad was totally going off. I knew sending him down here was a bad idea. He was fuming. Ma? Dad? Jeannie called out in confusion, hopping up. What are y'all doing here? Y'all 3 days early. Ma met Jeannie in the kitchen entryway and hugged him tight. We just needed to get back to our boys. We missed you too much. He missed her too. He really did. He studied her face to see if she was still tired or if she still looked sad. Because if there was any sadness on her face, Jeannie would know that they would have to go back to figuring out which parent they were going to live with. He'd also know he'd never take Shelley to Jamaica. Whoa, you stink. You smell like outside, Ma zinged him, scrunching her nose up to Jeannie. Couldn't even tell if it was a smile. There was a smile with it, but she didn't look tired like she usually did. That was a start. Jeannie kept his eyes on his mother as she went over to the couch, bent down and kissed Grandpop on the cheek. It's good to see you, Papa Harris. She whispered. Grandpop smiled sheepishly. How was Jamaica? Jeannie asked, his brain bouncing back and forth between being happy to see his own mother and totally freaking out. I mean, because, yeah, he was excited to see her, but he was about to confess something, maybe like the biggest mistake he had ever made, and he just didn't want anyone to be there when he did it. Because then he'd have to confess it to everyone. And the difference between parents and grandparents was that parents were allowed to get real mad. Ma broke into a smile, but before she could answer, Grandpop called out for Dad. Son? Jeannie quickly shifted his gaze as Dad stalked into the living room with Grandma and Ernie, who were holding the suitcase, followed behind Dad. Dad gave Ernie a big hug. His face was tight, his eyes narrowing and lowering in on Grandpop. Grandpop rocked forward, slowly getting to his feet, Ma reaching out to help him, but then pulling back, knowing that wasn't what Grandpop would have wanted. Boys, why don't you go upstairs and get your stuff ready to go, Ma said, her eyes darting back and forth between Dad and Grandpop. Yeah, that's a good idea. Sorry, guys. I lost my place. I'm so sorry. Yeah, that's a good idea. Grandma followed up, and Ernie, who had set the suitcase down, picked it back up. And Grandma grabbed Jeannie's shoulders, moving him around his father. The rain was picking up. Grandma hung back as Ma led the way upstairs. Halfway up, Jeannie asked Ernie about what had happened at Teeth Man's. He said everything was looking good, and I should be fine by the time school starts. Cool, Jeannie nodded. What do you say about the chipped one? Like they might be able to put a crown on it, like a king? That'd be sweet. I don't know, Ernie said at the top of the stairs. Maybe. As they entered the room, he turned to Jeannie and he gave him a look. A what's up with the bird kind of a look. Jeannie just shook his head. Ernie grimaced. In the room, Ma started pulling all the clothes from the blue dresser. So, I guess I don't need to ask you if you had a good time, huh, boys? I'm going to stop right here. It's 23 minutes in this chapter. It's almost done. I'm going to just pause this and finish it in a few minutes, guys. Thanks.